It was close to Christmas, and Jessica had picked up a night shift at the local dollar store. The aisles were quiet, the kind of silence that echoed in her ears. She liked the solitude. Sorting shelves while the world outside was cloaked in darkness gave her time to think. But there was something unsettling about the store at night. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, and the security cameras buzzed faintly, creating an uneasy atmosphere. As Jessica made her rounds down the holiday aisle, she noticed a shelf of Christmas ornaments that seemed out of place. Most of the items were cheap and colorful, but one ornament stood out: a black glass bauble, etched with strange, intricate designs. She picked it up, running her fingers over the cold surface. It felt heavier than it should have been, almost as if it was weighted down by something unseen. She shrugged it off, placing the ornament back on the shelf and moving to another aisle. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of sleigh bells jingling. Jessica froze. The store was empty. There was no one else around. Gripping her flashlight tightly, she slowly walked back toward the holiday aisle. The black bauble was no longer on the shelf. Jessica's heart raced as she scanned the aisle. The black bauble was now lying in the middle of the floor, glinting under the flickering lights. She bent down cautiously to pick it up, but as her fingers brushed against its surface, she heard a whisper, soft and indistinct, like a voice carried on the wind. She recoiled, dropping the bauble. The whisper grew louder, clearer. "Help! Me!" Jessica backed away, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She scanned the store, but it was still empty. The security cameras overhead buzzed louder, and the whispering voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Trying to steady her nerves, she grabbed her walkie-talkie to call the night manager. But all she heard on the other end was static. Then, through the crackling noise, a voice whispered, "Don't leave." Panic surged through Jessica. She bolted toward the manager's office, leaving the black bauble behind. But as she rounded the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. The bauble was now on the floor in front of her, as if it had been waiting. Determined to shake off her fear, Jessica kicked the bauble aside and rushed into the manager's office. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. The office felt safe, its walls lined with shelves of paperwork and security monitors displaying the empty aisles of the store. But as she watched the monitors, something caught her eye. In the holiday aisle, a shadow moved, a tall, thin figure gliding silently between the shelves. Jessica squinted at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The figure stopped in front of the black bauble, bending down as if to pick it up. Before she could process what she was seeing, the screen went black. The sound of sleigh bells filled the office, louder this time, accompanied by faint, echoing laughter. Jessica turned toward the door just as the lights in the office flickered out. In the darkness, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. She fumbled for the flashlight on her belt, switching it on just as the door creaked open. The hallway beyond was empty, but the black bauble was sitting on the floor, glowing more brightly than before. Jessica felt an overwhelming sense of dread as she realized the whispers had returned, now chanting in a low, guttural tone. Jessica grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. The chanting voices grew louder, filling the room with an oppressive energy. She covered her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The bauble began to shake violently, spinning on the floor as if possessed. Jessica watched in terror as it cracked open, revealing a dark, swirling mist inside. From the mist, a figure began to emerge, a shadowy humanoid form with hollow eyes that glowed like embers. The figure stepped toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Jessica stumbled backward, knocking over a shelf of paperwork. "What do you want?" she screamed. The shadow figure tilted its head, as if contemplating her question. Then it spoke, its voice a low, rumbling growl. "You brought me here. Now you must stay." Jessica bolted for the door, but the figure was faster. It blocked her path, its long, shadowy arms stretching out to trap her. The room grew colder, the air thick with the scent of decay. Jessica realized with growing horror that the bauble wasn't just cursed. It was a gateway to something far worse. Jessica's vision blurred as the shadow figure dragged her toward the bauble. The room around her seemed to twist and distort, the walls warping like melting wax. She screamed, clawing at the floor, but her efforts were futile. As the bauble's mist enveloped her, Jessica found herself in a different place. A dark, endless void filled with whispers and shadows. The ground beneath her feet was cold and unsteady, like walking on ice. All around her were faint shapes, humanoid figures shrouded in darkness. "Welcome," a voice echoed, deep and resonant. It was the shadow figure, now towering over her. "This is where we live, and now, so will you." Jessica stumbled backward, her heart racing. She realized the figures around her were former victims, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Some clutched black baubles, while others reached out to her, their mouths opening in silent pleas for help. "I'm not staying here," Jessica shouted, her voice shaking. She spotted a faint light in the distance, a small glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness. Gathering her courage, she ran toward it, the shadows closing in around her. Jessica sprinted toward the light, her legs burning with effort. The shadow figure pursued her, its long, claw-like hands reaching out to grab her. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of despair that nearly drowned out her thoughts. As she neared the light, Jessica realized it was a doorway, a shimmering portal back to the dollar store. But the shadow figure was closing in fast, its presence sucking the air from her lungs. With one final burst of energy, Jessica dove through the portal. She landed hard on the tile floor of the dollar store, gasping for breath. The lights flickered back to life, and the whispers ceased. The black bauble lay shattered on the floor, its dark mist dissipating into the air. Jessica didn't waste a second. She ran out of the store and never looked back. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. In her rearview mirror, she thought she saw a shadowy figure sitting in the back seat, its glowing eyes watching her every move. It was a quiet Friday evening when Emma decided to drop by the local dollar store. She needed a few last-minute items for her niece's birthday party: balloons, ribbons, and maybe a cheap toy to top off the gift. The store was eerily empty, save for a tired-looking cashier scrolling through their phone. As Emma wandered through the aisles, her attention was drawn to the clearance bin tucked away in the back corner of the store. It was filled with random items: broken picture frames, faded Christmas decorations, and old toys that no one wanted. Her eyes fell on a peculiar doll buried beneath the mess. A vintage porcelain doll, dressed in a tattered pink dress with lace trim. Something about the doll unsettled her. Its glassy blue eyes seemed to follow her every move, and its porcelain face was cracked in places, giving it an almost sinister smile. But it was only $1, and Emma figured her niece might like it for her collection. She picked up the doll, brushing off the dust. As she did, she felt a strange chill run down her spine. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and for a moment, she thought she heard a faint giggle. Shaking off the feeling, she headed to the register and paid for her items. That night, as Emma prepared the gift, she set the doll on the kitchen counter. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. When she glanced at it, the doll's head seemed to have turned slightly, but she dismissed it as her imagination. But when she turned off the lights and went to bed, the faint sound of giggling echoed through her apartment. The next morning, Emma woke up to find the doll sitting on her living room sofa. She froze. She had left it in the kitchen the night before. Unease crept over her as she approached it cautiously. Its glassy eyes seemed brighter in the daylight, almost alive. Thinking she might have moved it without remembering, Emma shrugged it off and placed the doll in the gift bag with the other party supplies. She headed out to her sister's house, determined to hand the doll off and forget about it. At the party, her niece Lily tore through her presents with glee. When she got to Emma's gift, she pulled out the doll and gasped with delight. "It's beautiful," Lily exclaimed, hugging the doll tightly. For a moment, Emma felt relieved. Maybe the doll wasn't as creepy as she thought. But then, as Lily ran off to show the doll to her friends, Emma noticed something odd. The spot where the doll had been sitting in the gift bag was scorched, as if burned. Later that evening, Emma's sister called. Her voice was frantic. "Emma, something's wrong with Lily's doll," she said. "It keeps moving on its own. I swear I found it standing in the hallway and Lily says it talks to her." Emma's blood ran cold. She promised to come over the next morning, but she didn't sleep that night. The faint giggling she'd heard before had returned, louder this time, echoing from the shadows of her apartment. When Emma arrived at her sister's house the next morning, the atmosphere was tense. Her sister Sarah looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "It's the doll," Sarah whispered. "It's evil." Emma tried to rationalize it. "It's just a doll, Sarah. Maybe Lily's imagination is running wild." But then Lily appeared, clutching the doll tightly. Her usually bright eyes were dull, and her face was pale. "The doll says it doesn't like you, Aunt Emma," Lily said in a monotone voice. Emma's stomach churned. She grabbed the doll from Lily and examined it closely. Beneath the lace trim of its dress, she noticed something etched into its porcelain surface. Symbols she didn't recognize, like ancient runes. Desperate for answers, Emma took the doll to an antique shop in town. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Graves, took one look at the doll and recoiled. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. Emma explained, and Mrs. Graves shook her head. "This doll is cursed. It was part of a set made in the late 1800s by a doll maker who practiced dark rituals. Each doll was said to carry a fragment of his soul, and they've been known to bring misfortune and death to anyone who keeps them." Emma's heart pounded as Mrs. Graves continued, "You need to destroy it. But be warned, these things don't let go easily." Determined to rid herself of the cursed doll, Emma decided to burn it. That night, she built a fire in her backyard and threw the doll into the flames. For a moment, the porcelain began to crack and blacken, and Emma felt a sense of relief. But then the fire roared to life, flaring unnaturally high. The doll's glassy eyes glowed brighter, and an ear-piercing scream echoed from the flames. Emma stumbled backward, watching in horror as the doll emerged from the fire, completely unscathed. The shadows around her seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as the doll levitated in the air. "You can't get rid of me," a deep guttural voice growled. "I am bound to you now." Emma ran into the house, locking the doors and windows. But the doll was already inside, sitting on her kitchen counter, its cracked smile wider than before. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy with the scent of burning wood. The doll's voice echoed through the house. "You shouldn't have tried to destroy me, Emma. Now you will pay." Emma's house was no longer her safe haven. It had turned into a playground for the cursed doll. The walls creaked as shadows twisted unnaturally. The air was heavy, suffused with an oppressive dread that made it hard to breathe. Determined to fight back, Emma armed herself with every piece of information Mrs. Graves had shared. The antique shop owner had mentioned that the doll could be contained if its connection to the soul fragment was severed. But to do so, Emma needed to find the exact ritual used by the doll maker, a nearly impossible task. Emma's search led her to a dusty library on the outskirts of town. She pored over ancient tomes and obscure texts late into the night, her eyes burning from exhaustion. Finally, in a faded book on occult practices, she found what she was looking for: a ritual to trap cursed objects and sever their hold. The instructions were precise and complex. It required a circle of protection, candles, salt, and the recitation of an incantation. But there was a warning. If the ritual failed, the curse would intensify, and the doll's wrath would become unstoppable. Emma had no choice. She gathered the materials and prepared the ritual in her living room. She drew a protective circle with salt and placed the doll in the center, surrounded by candles. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls as Emma began to chant the incantation. As the words left her lips, the doll's glassy eyes seemed to come alive, glowing with an unholy light. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and a guttural laugh echoed from the doll. "You think this will stop me?" it sneered. The ground beneath Emma trembled, and the shadows in the room coalesced into a towering figure, a twisted, humanoid form with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. "You've made a grave mistake," it growled. Emma's voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue the incantation. The doll's porcelain skin began to crack, black smoke seeping from the fractures. The shadowy figure howled in rage, its form dissolving into wisps of darkness. But then, the doll sprang to life, lunging at Emma with unnatural speed. She barely managed to dodge as it clawed at her face. With no other options, Emma grabbed a nearby iron fire poker and struck the doll with all her strength. The porcelain shattered, and the doll crumpled to the ground, motionless. For a moment, the room was silent. Emma's heart pounded as she stared at the broken pieces of the doll. But just as she began to breathe a sigh of relief, a chilling voice whispered in her ear, "This isn't over." The next morning, Emma awoke to sunlight streaming through her windows. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued her home was gone, and the doll's shattered remains lay on the living room floor. She packed the pieces into a box and drove to the edge of a nearby lake. Weighed down with heavy stones, the box sank into the dark waters, disappearing from sight. Emma felt a sense of closure as she watched the ripples fade. Weeks passed, and life began to return to normal. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Objects in her home seemed to move on their own, and faint whispers echoed in the dead of night. One evening, as she prepared for bed, she noticed a small package on her doorstep. Confused, she brought it inside and opened it. Her blood ran cold. Inside was the doll, fully intact, its glassy eyes staring up at her with a chilling smile. A note was tucked inside. "I told you, this isn't over." Emma screamed as the lights in her house flickered and died. The faint giggling that had haunted her before returned, louder and more sinister than ever. The curse wasn't gone. It had only just begun. David had always preferred night shifts. The calm, the quiet, the solitude. It suited him perfectly. He was a security guard at an old, sprawling mall on the edge of town. Business had been slow for years, and the place was more of a ghost town than a shopping hub. On this particular night, the silence felt heavier. The fluorescent lights in the vast, empty corridors hummed softly, casting pale shadows on the cracked tiles. David sat in his small security office, sipping lukewarm coffee while monitoring the grainy black and white feed from the security cameras. The hours dragged on as usual until something unusual caught his eye. One of the cameras, positioned at the far end of the mall, flickered. Static briefly replaced the feed before it stabilized. David squinted at the screen. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. "Probably a homeless person sneaking in again," he muttered to himself, grabbing his flashlight and keys. As he approached the corridor, the air grew colder. He shivered, tightening his jacket around him. "Hello?" David called out, his voice echoing eerily. The figure didn't move. It was facing a wall, standing unnaturally still. His footsteps slowed as unease crept up his spine. He flicked on his flashlight and aimed it at the figure, but as the beam illuminated the spot, David froze. There was nothing there. David returned to the security office, his nerves rattled. He replayed the camera footage, but the figure was gone, leaving no trace. He shook his head, convincing himself it was a trick of the light or his tired mind playing games. But as the clock struck midnight, he heard it, a faint but distinct sound of footsteps. They echoed through the silent mall, growing louder and more deliberate. Grabbing his flashlight again, David ventured out into the corridors. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Turning a corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. Wet footprints trailed across the floor, leading deeper into the mall. The prints weren't human. Each was elongated with claw-like impressions at the toes. David's hands trembled as he followed the trail, which led to the abandoned toy store. The doors were slightly ajar, creaking softly in the cold draft. "Is anyone there?" David whispered, pushing the door open. The toys, once neatly arranged, were now scattered across the floor. A porcelain doll sat on a shelf, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, a sinister smile painted on its cracked face. The doll's head turned slowly toward David. David stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The doll's painted eyes seemed to follow him as he retreated. But then, from deep within the store, a soft, childlike voice called out, "Play with me." The voice was faint but unmistakable. David's chest tightened as his instinct screamed for him to run, but curiosity, and perhaps a sense of duty, kept him rooted. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The only response was the sound of soft giggling, echoing through the dark aisles of the toy store. His flashlight beam scanned the room, landing on a row of dusty stuffed animals. They seemed to be moving. One by one, the toys fell off the shelves, landing with unsettling thuds on the floor. The giggling grew louder, more distorted, until it became a guttural laugh. David turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind him. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing right behind him. He didn't dare turn around. David bolted for the door, slamming his shoulder against it until it burst open. He sprinted down the corridor, his heavy footsteps echoing behind him. But then he realized his footsteps weren't the only ones. A second set of footsteps, faster and heavier, was closing in. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a shadowy figure chasing him, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved. "Leave me alone," David screamed, his voice bouncing off the walls. He rounded a corner and ducked into the security office, locking the door behind him. He pressed his back against it, gasping for air. The monitor screens flickered wildly, static consuming most of the feeds. On one screen, he saw the shadowy figure standing outside the office, staring directly at the camera. Its face was obscured, but its glowing red eyes pierced through the static. The lights in the office flickered, and David felt a chilling breeze sweep through the room. He turned slowly, and there it was, the figure standing in the corner, its eyes glowing brighter. David grabbed the nearest weapon, a heavy flashlight, and swung it at the figure, but it passed through the shadow like smoke. The figure let out a guttural growl, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The door burst open, and David seized the opportunity to run. He raced through the mall, the shadowy figure pursuing him relentlessly. Every light he passed flickered and went out, leaving him in near total darkness. Finally, he reached the main entrance. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Just as he unlocked the door, a cold hand grabbed his shoulder. "No one leaves," the figure hissed. With a surge of adrenaline, David shoved the door open and stumbled into the parking lot. The figure didn't follow. He turned back and saw it standing just inside the mall, its glowing eyes watching him as the doors slammed shut. David quit his job the next day, vowing never to return to the mall, but the nightmares followed him. He dreamt of the shadowy figure, of its glowing eyes and distorted voice. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, a familiar sound sent chills down his spine, the faint sound of footsteps. He turned toward the window, and there it was. The shadowy figure stood on the street below, its red eyes fixed on him. David realized with sinking dread that he hadn't escaped. The figure had followed him home. Samantha had just landed a temporary job at a Mannequin Warehouse. It was a massive industrial facility on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by an overgrown field and chain-link fences. Though the pay wasn't great, she needed the money to make it through the holidays. Her shift started at 7 p.m. and lasted until 3 a.m., a solitary night job meant to ensure the facility's security. Samantha's only company was the rows upon rows of lifeless mannequins scattered throughout the warehouse. Most were missing arms, heads, or torsos, giving the place an unsettling, fragmented look. She settled into the security office, its walls covered in faded safety posters. The room was cramped, with a single desk, an ancient computer, and a set of monitors that displayed live feeds from the security cameras. At first, the job was easy. She spent the first few hours scrolling through her phone and sipping on coffee. The occasional creak of the old building made her glance at the cameras, but there was never anything out of place. At least, not until midnight. One of the feeds began flickering. It was camera 5, positioned in the northeast section of the warehouse where the oldest mannequins were stored. Samantha leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the grainy footage. A mannequin that had been lying on the floor was now standing upright, its eyeless face turned toward the camera. Her stomach sank. She rewound the footage, hoping to find an explanation. But the screen just showed static for a moment, and when the image returned, the mannequin was already standing. "Probably a glitch," she whispered, though her voice trembled. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Samantha decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a walkie-talkie connected to the main office, she reluctantly stepped out of the security room. The warehouse was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of the building settling. She approached the northeast section, her flashlight beam bouncing off the glossy surfaces of the mannequins. The air was thick with the scent of old plastic and dust. When she reached the spot where the standing mannequin had been, it was gone. A shiver ran down her spine. She swept her flashlight across the rows of mannequins, her breath hitching when she spotted one standing in the next aisle over. Its eyeless face seemed to be tilted ever so slightly in her direction. "No way," she whispered, her pulse pounding. As she approached, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, the mannequin toppled over with a loud crash. Samantha jumped, letting out a startled cry. The sound of the fall echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. She hurried to the mannequin and examined it closely. It was just an ordinary mannequin with no sign of wires or mechanisms that could explain its movement. Then she heard it, a soft rustling noise from deeper in the warehouse. Her flashlight darted toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Samantha, get it together," she muttered to herself, her voice trembling. Back in the security office, Samantha replayed the footage again, hoping to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But the monitors told a different story. In one feed, she watched as a mannequin slowly turned its head. In another, a figure moved through the aisles, its stiff limbs jerking unnaturally. Her hands shook as she reached for the walkie-talkie. "This is Samantha. Is anyone else here? I think..." Before she could finish, the walkie-talkie crackled with static. Then came a voice, a deep, guttural whisper. "You're not alone." She dropped the walkie-talkie in shock, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she stood up. The lights in the security room flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The monitors went black for a moment, and when they came back on, her stomach dropped. The mannequins were no longer scattered randomly. They were all standing upright, arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the warehouse. At the center of the circle stood a mannequin with an oddly human-like face, its hollow eyes seeming to stare directly at the camera. Samantha grabbed her flashlight and bolted for the exit. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to get as far away from the warehouse as possible. But when she reached the main doors, they wouldn't budge. She yanked on the handle, her palms slick with sweat. Come on," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to a human. She turned and aimed her flashlight down the aisle. At the far end, the mannequins were moving. They didn't walk like people. Their motions were stiff, almost mechanical. One by one, they turned their hollow faces toward her. "No," Samantha whispered, backing away. As the mannequins closed in, Samantha's flashlight began to flicker. She tripped over a fallen mannequin, landing hard on the cold floor. The circle of mannequins loomed over her, their lifeless faces staring down. But one stood apart, a figure larger and more menacing, its human-like face etched with a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said in a voice that sent chills down her spine. Its mouth didn't move, but the words echoed in her mind. Samantha scrambled to her feet and swung her flashlight wildly, hoping to break free. But the mannequins didn't flinch. In a desperate move, Samantha reached for her phone and turned on its flashlight, the brighter beam cutting through the darkness. The mannequins recoiled, their stiff limbs jerking back as if in pain. She ran, weaving through the aisles, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached the emergency exit. This time, the door gave way, and she stumbled out into the cold night air. She didn't look back as she sprinted to her car, her mind racing with disbelief and terror. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing in the doorway of the warehouse was the leader mannequin, its grotesque smile glowing faintly in the moonlight. Samantha never returned to the job, but the nightmares followed her. Sometimes she swore she saw mannequins in the corner of her vision, watching, waiting. Marcus had just started a new job at a local dollar store, a small but well-stocked shop tucked into the corner of a quiet strip mall. It was the kind of place that seemed to attract unusual customers, especially during its late-night hours. He was tasked with working the graveyard shift alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was an easy job on paper. Restock shelves, man the register, and keep the place tidy. But something about the store felt off. The first night passed uneventfully, aside from the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights. But on his second shift, Marcus began to notice strange things. It started with the inventory. Items he was sure he had stocked the night before, cans of soup, packs of batteries, even cheap toys, would vanish, only to reappear on different shelves. At first, he blamed his own inexperience, thinking he'd misplaced them. But as the hours dragged on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The security cameras in the back room showed nothing unusual, but the hairs on his neck prickled whenever he turned his back to the aisles. At around 2 a.m., the doorbell chimed, signaling a customer. Marcus looked up from the counter to see a man in a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat walk in. His face was obscured by shadows, but something about him felt wrong. "Can I help you find anything?" Marcus called out. The man didn't respond. Instead, he moved silently down the candy aisle, his head tilting as if listening to something only he could hear. Marcus hesitated, then decided to leave him be. But when he glanced back at the security monitor, his blood ran cold. The man wasn't there. Marcus left the counter to check the candy aisle, his heart pounding. The store was eerily silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner. When he reached the aisle, it was empty. No sign of the man. "This can't be right," Marcus whispered to himself. He walked slowly toward the back of the store, checking each aisle as he went. The rows of cheap goods seemed to stretch endlessly, the dim lighting making them look almost infinite. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound. It came from the back corner of the store near the storage room. "Hello?" Marcus called, his voice trembling. There was no response. He approached the storage room cautiously, his hand hovering near the door handle. The sound grew louder, like someone rummaging through boxes. Summoning his courage, Marcus flung the door open and flicked on the light. The room was empty, the shelves neatly stacked with unopened boxes. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something chilling. Written in dust on the floor were the words, "He's watching." The rest of the shift passed in tense silence, and Marcus was relieved when dawn finally arrived. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the next night was worse. At midnight, the doorbell chimed again. This time it was a woman. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked distant, almost glassy. She walked straight to the freezer section, opened the door, and stood there staring at the frozen meals. Marcus cleared his throat. "Ma'am, can I help you?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring, her breath fogging up the glass. Feeling uneasy, Marcus decided to approach her. But as he rounded the counter, the woman turned her head sharply toward him. Her neck cracked loudly, and her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him freeze in place. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice hollow and echoing. Before Marcus could respond, the doorbell chimed again. He turned toward the entrance, but no one was there. When he looked back, the woman was gone. The freezer door stood open, its contents melting onto the floor. By the fourth night, Marcus was on edge. He had started carrying a small flashlight and kept his phone within reach at all times. Around 1 a.m., the lights flickered again, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they came back on, Marcus noticed something strange on the security monitor. In the far corner of the store, near the cleaning supplies aisle, a figure was standing. But it wasn't a person. It was distorted, its limbs impossibly long and its face featureless. Marcus blinked, hoping it was just a glitch in the camera feed. But when he looked up, he saw the same figure standing at the end of the aisle, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Who are you? What do you want?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing through the empty store. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its presence suffocating. Then, slowly, it began to raise one long arm, pointing directly at Marcus. He stumbled backward, knocking over a display of chips. When he looked up again, the figure was gone. Determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences, Marcus decided to explore the store thoroughly. While inspecting the back room, he noticed a trapdoor hidden beneath an old rug. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled it open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air grew colder as he descended, and the faint smell of mildew filled his nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood an old wooden chair. On the chair sat a single item, a black and white photograph of a young man who looked just like Marcus. Marcus couldn't sleep that day. The photograph haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being lured into something he didn't understand. On his final shift, everything came to a head. The lights failed entirely, plunging the store into darkness. The distorted figure appeared again, this time standing directly behind the counter. "You were never supposed to leave," it said in a deep, echoing voice. Marcus bolted for the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the figure reaching out for him, its long fingers closing around his arm. The next morning, the store manager arrived to find the doors locked from the inside. Marcus was never seen again, but his name tag was found sitting on the counter alongside the black and white photograph. Tina had always been a skeptic. A college student working the night shift at a small-town dollar store, she didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or urban legends. But when her coworker, Paul, warned her about the store's basement, she couldn't resist investigating. "The basement?" Tina asked, arching an eyebrow. "What's so scary about some dusty boxes and a leaky pipe?" Paul shook his head, his face pale. "I'm serious. Weird stuff happens down there. Lights flicker, boxes move on their own, and people hear voices. Just stay away, okay?" Of course, that warning only piqued Tina's curiosity. On her second shift, the store was dead quiet. A few customers trickled in and out, but by midnight, Tina was alone. She remembered Paul's warning and decided to check out the basement during her break. Armed with her phone flashlight, she unlocked the basement door and descended the creaky wooden stairs. The air was musty, and the faint smell of mildew tickled her nose. At first glance, the basement was ordinary. Rows of metal shelves stacked with overstocked goods and seasonal decorations. But as she walked deeper, her flashlight flickered. "Great," she muttered, smacking the side of her phone. That's when she noticed something odd. One of the shelves had been pushed aside, revealing a hidden door. The door was old, its wooden surface cracked and warped with age. Rusty chains were wrapped around it, secured with a heavy padlock. A chill ran down Tina's spine as she stared at it. Why would they lock this up? She whispered to herself. She reached out to touch the door, But the moment her fingers brushed the wood, she heard a soft whisper behind her. "Don't." Tina spun around, her flashlight sweeping across the basement. No one was there. Her heart pounded as she tried to laugh it off. "Get it together, Tina. You're just imagining things." Still, the door intrigued her. She decided to ask the manager about it the next day, but when she mentioned the locked door during her next shift, the manager's reaction was unsettling. "Who told you about that door?" he snapped, his face tense. "I saw it when I was downstairs," Tina replied, confused. "What's the big deal?" The manager sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, that door stays locked for a reason. Don't mess with it, trust me." Tina couldn't stop thinking about the door. The manager's reaction only fueled her curiosity. She decided to search the store for the key during her shift. After hours of searching, she found an old, dusty key hidden in the back office drawer. It looked ancient, its metal tarnished with age. Holding the key in her trembling hand, Tina descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was deafening. When she reached the door, she hesitated. For the first time, she felt a pang of doubt. But curiosity got the better of her. She slid the key into the padlock and turned it. The lock clicked open, and the chains fell away with a metallic clang. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A foul stench wafted up, making Tina gag. "What the hell is this?" she muttered, covering her nose with her sleeve. Against her better judgment, she started down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, Tina found herself in a small circular room. The walls were made of stone, and strange symbols were carved into the surface. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table, covered in wax drippings and surrounded by unlit black candles. On the table lay a leather-bound book, its cover engraved with the same symbols on the walls. Tina hesitated before picking it up. The book was filled with handwritten text in a language she didn't recognize. The pages felt ancient, brittle to the touch. As she flipped through the book, a low growl echoed through the room. Tina froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The growl grew louder, and shadows began to move along the walls, twisting and writhing like living creatures. Panicking, Tina grabbed the book and bolted up the stairs. But when she reached the basement, the door slammed shut in front of her, trapping her inside. Tina pounded on the basement door, screaming for help, but no one answered. Behind her, the growling grew louder. She turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the staircase, its form barely human. Its glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto her. Tina backed away, clutching the book to her chest. The creature stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it hissed, its voice a mix of rage and sorrow. "I didn't mean to," Tina cried. "I'll put it back, I swear." The creature stopped, its head tilting as if considering her words. Then, without warning, it lunged at her. Tina screamed, throwing the book at the entity. The moment the book left her hands, the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek and dissolved into smoke. The basement door swung open, and Tina ran out, her heart pounding. Tina didn't return to work after that night. She handed in her resignation and vowed never to set foot in the dollar store again. But the experience left her shaken. She couldn't shake the feeling that something from the basement had followed her. A week later, she woke up in the middle of the night to find the leather-bound book on her bedside table. Her blood ran cold as she noticed the writing on the first page. "You can't escape.